What would you do if you found a wild horse, wounded and alone, in the middle of the snow? Most people would walk away, but Jake, a reclusive ex-cowboy, made a choice that would change his life forever. In the heart of the Rocky Mountains, battling one of the harshest winters, he stumbles upon a mysterious white stallion, bleeding and barely alive. But what he doesn't know is that this encounter will bring danger, ruthless hunters, and a secret hidden in the forest. Can he really save this wild animal? Or are some creatures never meant to be tamed? This is a story of survival, courage, and an unbreakable bond between a man and a horse. So, leave a like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into this epic journey through the wild. Hit play and discover Ghost's fate. The wind howled through the valley like a wounded beast, carrying with it an unforgiving chill that crept into every crack and crevice. The Rocky Mountains, blanketed in thick layers of snow, stood silent and indifferent, an unyielding fortress of ice and solitude. Jake Holloway pulled his worn-out coat tighter around his broad shoulders, his breath visible in the freezing air. His gloved hands clutched the handle of the axe as he stood beside a freshly chopped pile of wood. His boots, cracked from years of use, sank into the deep snow with every step. This winter was one of the worst he had ever seen. A brutal force that tested both man and beast. The isolation wasn't new to him. It had been nearly a decade since he had walked away from the world he once knew. 10 years since he had lost everything. There was no need for a clock or calendar here. The passing of time was marked only by the changing of the seasons and the way his body had begun to feel heavier with each year. Jake's cabin sat at the base of a snow-covered ridge, tucked away in a dense patch of pine trees. Built from logs he had cut himself, it was sturdy but far from luxurious. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace barely reached the corners, and the old wooden floors creaked under his weight. His only company was the occasional visit from a curious fox or a scavenging wolf. He wasn't always this way. Once upon a time, he had been a rancher, a damn good one. He had spent years working on his father's land, breaking horses and tending cattle. But life had a cruel way of taking what a man loved the most. He had buried his wife and son in the cold Wyoming soil, and with them, any reason to stay. So, he left, sold what little remained, packed his horse, and disappeared into the mountains. Out here, there was no need for conversation. No one to ask about the past. No one to remind him of what he had lost. Tonight, though, even the silence felt heavy. Jake sat on the wooden porch, staring at the moonlit snowfield beyond the tree line. A bottle of whiskey sat beside him, unopened. The temptation was there, but he knew better. Alcohol and solitude were a dangerous mix. The fire inside crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the walls. He let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting shut for just a moment, until something in the distance broke the silence. A sound, faint, almost lost in the wind. Jake sat up, his body immediately alert. He knew the sounds of the mountains well, the groan of shifting ice, the snap of brittle branches under the weight of snow. But this was different. It was a sound of pain, a low, strained whinny. A horse. Jake's brow furrowed. There hadn't been wild horses in this part of the mountains in years, not since the government had cracked down on roundups. The only horses around were the ones owned by ranchers miles away. He reached for his rifle out of habit, slinging it over his shoulder before stepping off the porch. The air bit at his face as he moved toward the sound, his boots crunching against the ice beneath the snow. The deeper he went into the woods, the louder the sound became. And then, a trail of blood. Bright against the white snow, it led a winding path through the trees. Jake's jaw tightened. He had seen plenty of wounded animals before, but something about this felt different. His instincts told him to turn back, but something else, something deeper, urged him forward. And so, he followed. Jake followed the trail of blood through the thick snow, his senses sharpening with each step. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the occasional snap of a brittle branch beneath his boots. His rifle remained slung over his shoulder, his gloved fingers instinctively brushing against the stock. Out here, a man never knew what he might run into. A wounded animal, a hungry predator, or something worse. The further he walked, the more his gut told him that something wasn't right. The blood wasn't scattered in drops. It was smeared, streaked. Whatever was hurt had tried to keep moving but had eventually collapsed. The tracks led toward a small clearing ahead, and as Jake rounded a fallen tree, his breath hitched. There, half buried in the snow, lay a white stallion. Jake froze. The horse was a magnificent creature, even in its weakened state. Its coat, though now dirted with blood, was as pale as the snow itself, and its powerful muscles were barely concealed beneath its trembling frame. Steam rose in soft clouds from its nostrils as it struggled to breathe, its flanks rising and falling in uneven bursts. Jake's first instinct was to scan the area. What the hell happened here? A mountain lion attack? No, there were no claw marks, no shredded flesh. The horse had long gashes along its hindquarters, likely from running through dense brush or barbed wire. But the real concern was a deep wound on its shoulder, still oozing fresh blood. A bullet wound. Jake clenched his jaw. Poachers. He had seen their work before. Greedy bastards would set traps or fire at wild horses, either to sell them on the black market or simply for sport. Jake had no patience for men like that. The stallion flinched as Jake took a cautious step closer, its wild eyes darting toward him. Even now, half dead, it was ready to fight. "Easy," Jake murmured, his voice low, calm. "Ain't gonna hurt you." The horse's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but it didn't relax. It couldn't. Jake assessed the situation quickly. Leaving it here meant certain death, either from blood loss, exposure, or worse, if the poachers came back to finish the job. But bringing it back to his cabin? That was a whole other problem. A wounded wild horse wouldn't just let him walk up and throw a rope around its neck. He let out a breath, shaking his head. "This is stupid," he muttered to himself. The horse snorted, as if agreeing. Jake took off his gloves and stuffed them in his coat pocket, slowly lowering himself to one knee in the snow. He reached out, moving inch by inch, letting the stallion get used to his scent. The horse tensed, every muscle in its body screaming for flight, but it was too weak to go anywhere. "You've got two choices," Jake said, his voice steady. "You let me help, or you die out here. Either way, I ain't leaving." The horse didn't understand his words, but it understood his tone. It stared at him for a long moment, its breath still coming in uneven bursts. Then, slowly, its head lowered. Jake nodded. That was the closest thing to trust he was going to get. Moving quickly but carefully, he removed his scarf and pressed it against the bullet wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. The stallion flinched but didn't fight. That was a good sign. "This is going to be rough, buddy," Jake muttered as he worked. "But you're not dying today." He would need to get the horse back to his cabin, somehow clean the wound, and hope to God it didn't get infected. It was a gamble, but he wasn't about to let the stallion freeze to death in the snow. Jake stood and whistled, a sharp, commanding sound that echoed through the trees. A few moments later, his own horse, Buck, trotted into view from where he had been tied further back in the woods. The brown gelding's ears perked forward at the sight of the wounded stallion, but he remained calm, a trait that had saved Jake's life more than once. "Hope you don't mind some company," Jake muttered as he grabbed the rope from Buck's saddle and moved back to the white stallion. The next part wasn't going to be easy. He had to get Ghost on his feet before the poachers returned. The stallion's ragged breathing was the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the frozen wilderness. Jake Holloway knew the odds weren't in his favor. A wounded wild horse, weakened by blood loss and exhaustion, wasn't likely to make it through the night. Not in temperatures this brutal. Yet here he was, kneeling in the snow, pressing his scarf against the wound of a creature that could very well kill him with a single well-placed kick. It was a stupid risk. But then again, Jake had made a lifetime of taking stupid risks. He let out a slow breath, scanning the stallion's body again. The bleeding had slowed, but the horse was still weak. Its ears flicked forward and back, caught between fear and the deep, primal instinct to run. The problem was, it didn't have the strength left to do so. Jake reached for the rope looped over Buck's saddle, measuring the distance between himself and the stallion. If he moved too fast, the horse would panic. If he moved too slow, The cold would keep setting in. "All right, Ghost," he muttered under his breath, giving the stallion a name before he even had the right to. "We gotta get you up." Ghost's nostrils flared, and Jake swore the horse was glaring at him. Good. A little fight meant there was still life in him. Carefully, Jake looped the rope into a loose slip knot, easing it forward like a lasso. The stallion shuffled uneasily, hooves scraping the packed snow. There was no telling how Ghost would react. Jake had broken horses before, but this wasn't a horse trained to take a saddle. This was a wild creature, forged by the mountain and meant for open space. "Just need you on your feet," Jake coaxed. "I ain't breaking you. Just keeping you breathing." He knew Ghost didn't understand the words, but tone meant everything. Horses didn't respond to force, not if you want to trust. The rope slipped over Ghost's neck, resting there with barely any tension. Jake held the other end loosely, giving the stallion space. Then, he moved. Ghost jerked, nostrils flaring, eyes rolling white. But Jake didn't pull. He just stood his ground, let the horse feel the weight of the situation. "You fight. You waste strength you ain't got," Jake muttered, his voice carrying over the still night. "You let me help. Maybe we both make it out of this." For a long moment, nothing happened. The stallion stood still, his chest rising and falling in deep, uneven breaths. His muscles twitched beneath his blood-stained coat. Jake could see the calculations happening behind those wild, intelligent eyes. Then, with a trembling effort, Ghost moved. First, he shifted his weight. Then, with a rough exhale, he planted his front hooves and pushed himself up onto shaky legs. The movement nearly sent him tumbling back down, but Jake was there, steadying the rope just enough to offer balance, not force. Ghost snorted, his legs trembling, but he stayed up. Jake exhaled, relief washing over him. "Attaboy," he murmured. The stallion stood swaying, clearly not ready to go anywhere fast. His breathing was labored, but he was up, and that was the first step. Now came the hard part. Jake glanced back toward Buck, who stood watching the scene with the patience of a seasoned ranch horse. The old gelding had seen it all. "We're gonna have to take it slow, buddy," Jake said, rubbing Buck's neck. Then, turning back to Ghost, he murmured, "You keep standing. I'll do the walking." The haul to the cabin, the journey back was slow, painfully slow. Jake led Ghost with cautious, measured steps, keeping the rope loose but present. He didn't pull, didn't rush. He just walked, one step at a time, letting the stallion find his own rhythm. More than once, Ghost stumbled, his legs threatening to give out. Each time, Jake stopped, giving him a moment to regain balance before moving again. Halfway home, it started snowing. The flakes fell heavy and slow, dusting Jake's hat and coat, dampening the stallion's already chilled frame. The cold gnawed at Jake's fingers through his gloves, but he didn't stop. Stopping meant freezing. Freezing meant death. Finally, after what felt like hours, the dark shape of his cabin emerged through the trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcome sight in the bitter night. Jake led Ghost into the small fenced-in paddock near the cabin. It wasn't much, just a simple corral he had built years ago when he had thought he might take in another horse. He hadn't. Not until now. A place to rest. Ghost staggered into the corral, barely making it to the straw-covered ground before his legs buckled and he collapsed again. Jake unlooped the rope, crouching beside him. He placed a firm but careful hand against the stallion's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his exhausted body. "You did good," Jake murmured. "Real good." Ghost didn't move, but his breathing had slowed, not in a bad way, but in the way of a creature finally allowed to rest. Jake stood, rolling his shoulders against the ache creeping into his muscles. There was still work to do. He moved quickly, fetching an old wool blanket and tossing it over the horse's back, shielding him from the worst of the wind. Then, he grabbed an armful of hay, scattering it near Ghost's head. Food wouldn't fix him overnight, but it was a start. Jake knew he'd have to clean the wound properly in the morning. For now, keeping Ghost alive through the night was all that mattered. With one last glance at the stallion, Jake stepped back toward the cabin, his mind heavy with exhaustion. He had done what he could, but something told him this was just the beginning. The wind howled outside the cabin, rattling the wooden shutters like an impatient ghost. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. Jake sat at the small kitchen table, his fingers wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His mind wasn't on the warmth of the fire or the fatigue weighing heavy on his limbs. It was out there, in the paddock, with the half-dead horse he had just hauled through the snow. Ghost had barely moved since collapsing onto the hay, his breathing slow but steady beneath the blanket Jake had thrown over him. The stallion was alive, for now, but if infection set in, if his body gave out from exhaustion, none of this would matter. Jake sighed and scrubbed a hand over his beard, then pushed himself up from the chair. Rest would have to wait. The horse came first. The first attempt the cold bit at his face the second he stepped outside. The snow was still falling, lighter now, but persistent. The fence surrounding the paddock creaked in the wind, and the only sound beyond that was Ghost's slow, uneven breaths. Jake approached cautiously, boots crunching against the icy ground. Horses were prey animals by nature, and a wounded one was 100 times more dangerous. Ghost had barely tolerated him on the trek home, but now, in an enclosed space, things could go south real fast. "All right, big guy," Jake murmured as he crouched near the stallion's side. "This ain't gonna be fun, but we gotta get it done." Ghost flinched at his voice, but didn't try to move. His exhaustion was working in Jake's favor, for now. Jake pulled out a small leather satchel he had brought from the cabin and set it in the snow beside him. Inside was a roll of bandages, a bottle of antiseptic, and an old hunting knife he had sterilized over the fire. Not much, but it would have to do. With careful hands, he peeled back the wool blanket, exposing the stallion's pale coat, marred with streaks of dried blood. Ghost snorted, shifting slightly, but didn't lash out. "Good boy," Jake muttered. "Just hang in there." The bullet wound on the shoulder was the worst of it. It wasn't deep enough to kill, but it was deep enough to fester. If the bullet was still inside, infection would set in fast. Jake had seen it happen before. He grabbed a clean rag from his bag and poured some of the antiseptic over it. The scent of alcohol burned sharp in the cold air. Then, slowly, he reached for the wound. Ghost reacted instantly. With a sudden jerk of his body, the stallion thrashed, kicking up hay and snow as he tried to scramble to his feet. Jake barely had time to move before a hoof whistled past his face. He fell backward onto the frozen ground, cursing under his breath as he watched Ghost struggle to stand. Legs shaking, sides heaving with deep, panicked breaths. "Damn it, take it easy," Jake growled, keeping his distance. Ghost staggered, his muscles tensed like coiled wire. His ears flattened against his head, and his eyes, wild, defiant, desperate, locked onto Jake like he was a predator ready to strike. They stayed like that for a long moment. Jake didn't move, didn't speak, didn't give the stallion a reason to bolt. Finally, Ghost's legs buckled, and with a shuddering breath, he collapsed back onto the hay. Jake exhaled slowly, pushing himself up from the ground. "Well," he muttered, brushing the snow from his coat, "that went to hell real quick." A different approach. Jake knew one thing for certain. He wasn't gonna win this with brute force. He had spent years working with cattle, breaking stubborn broncos on his father's ranch, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was that trust had to be earned. "You don't know me," he murmured, crouching down again, keeping his voice steady. "I get that. And you got every damn reason not to." Ghost's ears twitched slightly, but he kept his head low. Jake reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sugar cube. It was a rare thing to have out here. He usually kept them for his coffee when he made the rare supply run into town, but right now, this was a hell of a lot more important than caffeine. Holding it out flat on his palm, he stayed perfectly still. Ghost sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring slightly. For a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't take it. Then, ever so slowly, his lips brushed against Jake's hand, taking the sugar cube into his mouth. Jake let out a quiet chuckle. "There we go," he said softly. "Ain't so bad, huh?" The stallion chewed sluggishly, clearly more exhausted than anything. But he hadn't bitten, and he hadn't bolted. That was progress. Jake took advantage of the moment, carefully reaching for the wound again. This time, Ghost flinched, but he didn't fight. Jake worked quickly. He cleaned the wound as best as he could, pressing the rag against it to stop the bleeding. The antiseptic burned, and Ghost let out a sharp breath, but he didn't lash out. "Just a little more, buddy," Jake muttered. By the time he finished wrapping the stallion's shoulder with clean bandages, his own hands were shaking from the cold. Ghost let out a long, tired exhale, his body sagging against the hay. Jake ran a hand down his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in. "Gonna be a long night," he murmured to himself, pushing himself to his feet. He tossed another blanket over the horse, making sure he was warm before stepping back toward the cabin. For the first time since finding Ghost in the snow, Jake felt something strange stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He had spent 10 years avoiding connection, avoiding responsibility, but now there was no turning back. Ghost was his problem now, and Jake Holloway wasn't the kind of man to walk away from a fight. The night settled heavy over the mountains, thick with silence and frost. The wind had died down, leaving only the distant creak of ice-laden branches and the occasional shuffle of hooves from the paddock. Ghost was still alive, weak, but alive. That was something. Jake stood on the porch, arms crossed against the cold, eyes fixed on the dark tree line beyond the fence. Something wasn't sitting right with him. He had spent enough winters alone in these mountains to know when something was off. The quiet tonight wasn't the kind that came with peaceful snowfall. It was the kind that came before trouble. He took a slow sip from the tin cup in his hand, the bitter taste of coffee doing little to warm him. Something was out there, watching, and he wasn't the only one who felt it. Ghost, still half buried in the hay, suddenly lifted his head, ears twitching toward the trees. His body stiffened, his nostrils flaring. Jake followed his gaze. At first, there was nothing but the endless sprawl of black silhouettes against the snow. But then, a shift. A movement too large to be a deer, too slow to be a predator. And then he saw it. A massive black stallion. It stood just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the darkness, watching. Completely still. Completely silent. Jake's grip on the cup tightened. That was no Lost Ranch horse. This one was wild. Through and through. Its muscular frame, thick with winter fur, was larger than any Mustang Jake had ever seen. Its long mane, tangled and wind-blown, caught the moonlight like strands of dark silk, and its eyes, dark, intelligent, piercing, were locked onto Ghost. Not on Jake, not on the cabin, just on Ghost. Jake exhaled through his nose, setting the cup down on the railing. "Well," he muttered, "guess you got a friend, huh?" Ghost didn't react to his voice. His entire focus was on the stallion in the woods. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was something else. Recognition. An unspoken connection. Jake had spent years working with horses. He knew their body language better than he knew most people. The way Ghost held himself now, tense, ears forward, tail still. It wasn't the posture of an animal preparing to fight. It was the posture of an animal waiting. The black stallion didn't move closer. It was waiting too. Jake narrowed his eyes. Had they known each other before? Had Ghost been part of this one's herd? Wild horses stuck together for survival. If this stallion had been the leader, then losing Ghost, a young, strong stallion in his own right, must have left a mark on the herd. Maybe the black one had been searching for him ever since. Jake sighed, shaking his head. He had no business interfering with that kind of bond. But at the same time, Ghost wasn't ready to go anywhere. Not yet. "Sorry, big guy," Jake murmured toward the dark figure in the woods. "Your boy ain't strong enough to run with you just yet." The stallion didn't react, didn't even flick an ear. Jake stayed there a moment longer, waiting to see if it would move. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it turned and melted back into the trees. Jake let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well," he muttered, glancing at Ghost, "guess you ain't as alone as you thought." Ghost blinked slowly, his body relaxing just a little. Jake picked up his cup again, taking a final sip before heading inside. He left the door unlocked, not because he expected company, but because he had a feeling the black stallion would be back. And something told him this wasn't over. Morning came slow, dragging a dull gray light over the snow-covered mountains. Jake woke with a knot in his back and a weight in his chest. He had barely slept, his mind too occupied with what he had seen the night before. That black stallion. Jake had spent enough time around wild animals to know that one didn't just stick around for no reason. Ghost wasn't just another lost Mustang. He belonged to something bigger, and that meant others might be looking for him. The problem was, not everyone who looked for wild horses did it with good intentions. Signs of trouble. Jake stepped outside, boots crunching in the frost, and immediately noticed something was off. Ghost was still lying in the paddock, his white coat dusted with fresh snow, but his head was up, ears stiff, nostrils flared. He wasn't looking toward the forest this time. He was looking at the ground, more specifically, at something just beyond the fence. Jake's stomach twisted as he walked closer. Boot prints. Not his. Not from last night. These were fresh, and they weren't alone. Beside them, half buried in the morning snow, were empty bullet shells. Jake felt his pulse slow, then sharpen. Poachers. His jaw clenched as he crouched down, picking up one of the brass casings between his fingers. It was still cold, but not frozen solid. That meant whoever had been here wasn't far ahead. Maybe an hour, maybe less. Ghost let out a tense exhale, shifting his weight in the hay. He knew, too. Jake closed his fingers around the casing, his knuckles whitening. He had seen this before. Ranchers out in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado had been dealing with illegal horse roundups for years. Some men did it to sell the animals for slaughter across the border. Others just saw wild horses as pests, stealing grazing land meant for cattle. Jake hadn't given a damn about those fights in years. Not until now. Not until Ghost. Tracking the trespassers, Jake rose to his feet, scanning the tree line. The fresh snow gave him a clear trail to follow. He walked back to the porch, grabbed his rifle from where it rested against the cabin wall, and slung it over his shoulder. Then, he turned back to Ghost. "Don't do anything stupid while I'm gone," he muttered, pulling his hat lower against the wind. Ghost snorted, which Jake took as the closest thing to a response he'd get. He followed the boot prints into the woods, moving with the kind of quiet that only came from years of knowing how to walk these mountains. The tracks were spaced out. Whoever these guys were, they weren't moving slow. A bad sign. Jake tightened his grip on his rifle. After about 20 minutes of walking, he spotted the first real sign of them. A makeshift hunting camp, tucked into a clearing. A smoldering fire, half covered by snow. A pair of tire tracks leading away down an old logging road. Jake scanned the site. No horses, no men, but plenty of bad signs. A length of rope, looped for a lasso. A set of bolus, weighted cords used to entangle a horse's legs. And worst of all, a blood-stained saddle blanket. Jake's throat tightened. They had already caught something. And if they were still out here, they'd be coming back. A warning given. A warning taken. Jake took a slow breath, then made a decision. He pulled out his hunting knife, walked to the nearest tree, and carved a long, deep gash into the bark. It was an old cowboy trick, a mark that meant, "Stay the hell away." Then, he did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled the bolt on his rifle, raised it to the sky, and fired a single shot. The sound ripped through the silence of the mountains. A warning. He wanted them to know someone was watching. Jake exhaled, lowering the rifle. He wasn't stupid. This wasn't over. He turned on his heel and headed back toward the cabin. If these bastards were coming for Ghost, they were gonna have to come through him first. The mountains had a way of keeping secrets. Some men thought they could own this land, bend it to their will, but the wilderness had its own laws. And Jake Holloway had learned to live by them. By the time he made it back to the cabin, the sky had begun to darken. Evening came early in the dead of winter, stealing the light before a man was ready. His boots crunched over the snow as he crossed the yard, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The air was thick with tension. Ghost was still in the paddock, but something about his posture set off a warning in Jake's gut. The stallion was standing now, fully on his feet for the first time since Jake had found him, his ears pinned back, muscles tight with nervous energy. His coat shimmered like pale ice in the fading light, and his dark eyes were locked on something far beyond the cabin. The tree line where the black stallion had appeared the night before. Jake cursed under his breath. He knew that look. He had seen it before in wild horses that weren't meant to be caged. Ghost wasn't just recovering. He was planning to run. A desperate need for freedom. Jake approached slowly, keeping his hands at his sides. "Easy now," he murmured. Ghost's tail flicked sharply. The stallion's breath came heavy, visible in the freezing air. Jake had been around horses long enough to know what came next. Ghost wasn't gonna wait for permission. The stallion coiled like a spring, then lunged forward. Jake barely had time to react before Ghost surged toward the fence, his hooves kicking up snow and ice as he made a break for it. "Damn it!" Jake shouted, dropping the rifle from his shoulder as he ran after him. Ghost wasn't fully healed, but the instinct to escape was stronger than the pain. His front hooves slammed against the wooden rails of the paddock, rattling the entire fence line. The old wood groaned under the force, but held. For now, a man and a wild horse. Jake moved fast, cutting across the paddock before Ghost could try again. "You want to die out there?" he snapped, voice sharp against the cold. "You ain't ready, boy." Ghost jerked his head back toward him, nostrils flaring, eyes wide and frantic. He was trapped between two instincts, to flee or to fight. Jake knew the feeling all too well. He let out a slow breath, lowering his shoulders, making himself smaller. He had been handling horses since he was old enough to walk, and the one thing his father had taught him was that you never met a wild thing with force. "You think I want to keep you here?" Jake muttered. "You think I want this any more than you do?" Ghost pawed the ground, ears flicking. Jake took a careful step closer. "I get it," he continued, voice softer now. "Ain't meant to be tied down. Ain't meant to be tamed." Ghost huffed, shifting his weight. "But you run now?" Jake pointed to the dark forest beyond the fence. "You ain't making it to sunrise." Ghost didn't understand the words, but he understood something in Jake's tone. A moment passed, then another. Finally, Ghost stopped straining against the fence. Jake exhaled, tension leaving his body. He reached slowly into his coat pocket, pulling out another sugar cube, the last one he had left. Ghost eyed it. His breath was still fast, his body still tight, but he didn't run. That was enough for now. A hard realization. Jake didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the window, watching the stallion through the frost-covered glass. Ghost had calmed, but Jake knew this wasn't over. The stallion wasn't his to keep. Maybe he never had been. Jake had spent the last 10 years running from things he didn't want to face. Loss, regret, the kind of pain that sunk into a man's bones and never left. He had told himself that solitude was easier, that he was better off out here, where nothing could touch him. But Ghost had changed that. Now, Jake had a responsibility, and he had a choice to make. Keep him here, or let him go. And deep down, he already knew the answer. Ghost belonged to the wild, and soon, one way or another, he'd have to return to it. The next morning, Jake woke to the sound of distant gunfire. One shot, then another. He was on his feet before he was even fully awake, instincts kicking in before reason. His rifle was already in his hands as he shoved open the cabin door. Ghost was standing stiff in the paddock, ears pointed toward the tree line. His body was tense, his breath visible in sharp clouds in the cold morning air. Jake followed his gaze, and that's when he saw them. 3 men, coming out of the woods. A familiar kind of trouble. They weren't moving fast, but they weren't sneaking either. They wanted to be seen. Jake recognized the type instantly. Ranch hands turned poachers. Men who thought the land owed them something, who saw wild horses as nothing more than property to be taken. The man in front was tall, built like a bull, with a heavy coat draped over his broad shoulders. His boots were worn, his gloves stained dark with years of work, but it was his eyes that told Jake everything he needed to know. Cold, calculating, the kind of man who didn't believe in second chances. The other 2 were younger, probably in their late 20s, but just as dangerous. One had a lasso looped at his belt. The other carried a rifle. Jake stepped off the porch, gun hanging loosely at his side. "Mornin'," the lead man drawled, stopping a few yards from the paddock fence. His voice was the kind that didn't need to be raised to carry weight. Jake didn't answer right away. He took his time, measuring the men, the distance, the odds. Finally, he spoke. "You boys lost?" The man grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Nah, just looking for something that belongs to us. His gaze flicked to Ghost. Jake's grip on his rifle tightened. Here we go. A line in the snow, you mean the horse? Jake asked, his voice calm, controlled. Yeah, the man said, nodding. One of ours got loose last week. White stallion. Fast. We've been tracking him since yesterday. Jake let out a slow breath through his nose. Lying son of a bitch. Ghost wasn't some lost ranch horse. This was a wild stallion. They weren't here to take back what was theirs. They were here to finish what they started. Jake had spent most of his life avoiding fights, but this one was already at his doorstep. I don't think so, Jake said evenly. The man's grin faltered. Come again. Jake took a step forward. I said, I don't think so. That ain't a ranch horse. That's a wild one. And from where I'm standing, looks like he don't belong to nobody. The two younger men shifted, uncomfortable. The lead man didn't. He just exhaled through his nose and tilted his head slightly. Look, he said, I get it. You're out here alone. You see a half-dead horse. You figure you'll do a good deed. Patch him up. That's real noble. He nodded toward the paddock. But that horse is worth money. And money's real scarce these days. Jake clenched his jaw. So that was it. It wasn't about food. It wasn't about necessity. It was about greed. And men like this? They didn't take no for an answer. Jake didn't blink, didn't move. You got 5 seconds to turn around, he said quietly. The man's grin disappeared completely. One of the younger guys took a nervous step back. The lead man? He held his ground. You really want to do this, old-timer? He asked. Jake cocked his head. Old-timer? He let the insult roll off him. He'd been called worse. Instead, he just lifted his rifle ever so slightly. Not enough to be a direct threat, just enough to make the message clear. The man's eyes darkened. A long moment stretched between them. Then, finally, he sighed. Shame, he muttered. Then he turned to his men. Let's go. Asterisk asterisk they hesitated, but only for a second. Then, without another word, they backed off. A war delayed. Not one. Jake didn't lower his rifle until they were out of sight. Only then did he let out a slow breath, tension leaving his shoulders. He turned back toward Ghost. The stallion was still watching the woods. His body was stiff, his ears pinned back. He knew, just as well as Jake did, that this wasn't over. Jake sighed. Yeah, he muttered, rubbing a hand down his face. I got a bad feeling too. The poachers would be back, and next time, they wouldn't be asking. The wind had shifted. Jake could feel it. A storm was coming, not in the form of snow or ice, but something far worse. A reckoning. He had stared down plenty of threats in his lifetime. Bar fights in Wyoming saloons, cattle thieves on the open range, men who thought their guns made them powerful. But there was something about this situation that felt different. This wasn't just his fight. Ghost stood in the paddock, his wounds healing, his strength returning. But the stallion was restless now, more than ever before. Every evening, he stood at the fence line, ears pricked toward the forest, waiting for the black stallion to return, waiting for the life he had been stolen from. Jake ran a hand down his face, sighing. He knew what had to happen next. A hard choice that night. He sat on the porch, watching Ghost as the fire inside the cabin crackled behind him. His rifle rested against the wooden steps. He wasn't expecting the poachers to return tonight, but he knew they would. Ghost, as if sensing Jake's thoughts, turned his head toward him. You ready to go, boy? Jake murmured. The stallion huffed, pawing at the frozen earth. Jake smirked to himself. Yeah, he muttered. Didn't think you'd be the type to stick around. The truth was, Jake had known this moment was coming since the night he found the horse bleeding in the snow. Wild things weren't meant to be caged, and Ghost belonged to the mountains. One last ride. Jake saddled up Buck before dawn, leading him into the paddock with a rope slung over his shoulder. Ghost eyed him cautiously but didn't spook. He had gotten used to Jake's presence, but trust was a different thing altogether. Jake wasn't about to force him. He stepped forward, slow and steady, holding the same sugar cubes he had been using over the past few weeks. Ghost hesitated. Then, finally, he took one from Jake's palm. Jake didn't smile, didn't speak. Instead, he looped the rope loosely around Ghost's neck, offering him a choice. Follow or stay. For a second, the stallion stood still. Then, without a fight, he followed. They rode out before the sun crested the ridge, Jake leading Ghost while Buck carried him through the deep snow. The black stallion would be waiting. The moment of truth. It took hours to reach the clearing where he had first seen the black stallion. Jake stopped Buck at the tree line, breath curling in the frozen air. Ghost pulled away slightly, sniffing the wind. His whole body went tense. Then, just as Jake had hoped, a shadow emerged from the woods. The black stallion. Jake let out a slow breath, watching as the massive Mustang stepped into the clearing, head high, eyes locked onto Ghost. They stood like that for a long time. No movement, no sound. Then, the black stallion snorted and turned. Ghost didn't hesitate. He took off after him. Jake watched as the two stallions disappeared into the trees, their hoofbeats fading into the mountains. He didn't call after Ghost, didn't try to stop him. He had known from the beginning. This was how it had to end. Ghost had never belonged to him. He had just been passing through. Jake exhaled, tipping his hat lower over his eyes. "Go easy, boy," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. Then, without another word, he turned Buck around and rode home. The ride back to the cabin was long and quiet. Too quiet. Jake had spent weeks tending to Ghost, patching his wounds, feeding him, keeping him alive. Now, the paddock was empty. The wild stallion was gone. And yet, Jake couldn't bring himself to regret it. He had done what he set out to do, saved the horse's life, gave him a fighting chance. Anything beyond that? That wasn't up to him. Some things just weren't meant to be owned. As the cabin came into view, Buck let out a soft huff, his ears flicking forward. Jake patted his neck absent-mindedly, lost in thought. Then he saw it. Tracks, boot prints. Fresh ones. Leading straight to the paddock. Jake stiffened, his hand automatically tightening on the rifle at his side. The poachers had come back. A reckoning. Jake swung off Buck in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the snow with a crunch. The air was thick with tension, charged like the sky before a lightning storm. A voice cut through the silence. "Well, would you look at that?" Jake turned. The lead poacher, the big bastard with the cold eyes, stood near the paddock, hands in his coat pockets, like he had all the time in the world. His two men flanked him, their stances less relaxed. One had a rifle slung over his shoulder. The other was gripping a coiled lasso, so tight his knuckles were white. Jake didn't move, didn't blink. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. The poacher smirked. "So are you, far as I see it." Jake exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "The horse is gone," he said, his voice flat. "You're wasting your time." The poacher's smirk faltered. "Gone?" Jake gave a single nod. The man's jaw clenched. He wasn't happy. One of the younger guys shifted nervously. "Boss, if he let it go." The older man shot him a look that shut him up fast. Jake watched them carefully. He could tell what was happening. This wasn't about the money anymore. This was about pride. They had come to take something from him, and now that Ghost was gone, they wanted blood instead. The breaking point. The poacher took a slow step forward. "You know how much that horse was worth?" Jake didn't answer. "More than this little cabin of yours. More than that sad old horse you're riding." Jake's grip on his rifle tightened just slightly. "You got a point to make?" The poacher let out a low chuckle, but his eyes were dark, cold. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he asked. "Keeping a wild horse from men like us?" He shook his head. "You don't get it, do you?" Jake remained silent. "Out here," the man continued, "things don't belong to the soft-hearted. They belong to the ones strong enough to take 'em." Jake finally spoke. "That why you run in a pack?" The younger guys shifted. The older man went still. Then, before Jake could react, he reached for his gun. Jake moved first. In a single motion, he cocked his rifle and fired into the snow at the man's feet. The gunshot cracked through the air like a bolt of lightning. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, the poacher slowly lifted his hands, a smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. "Well, well," he muttered. "Looks like the old man still got some fight in him." Jake didn't lower the rifle, didn't so much as breathe. "Turn around," he said. The poacher's smile faded. You really want to do this? Jake's voice was dead calm. You got 3 seconds before I decide. I don't care what happens next. 1 beat. 2. Then, finally, the poacher exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Damn waste of a good horse, he muttered. Then he turned. And just like that, they left. Jake didn't lower his rifle until their boot prints had disappeared into the trees. Lessons learned by the time he went inside. The adrenaline had begun to wear off. He poured himself a drink, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he sat by the window, staring out into the woods. Ghost was gone. The poachers weren't coming back. And for the first time in 10 years, Jake felt like he had done something that mattered. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. He had spent years thinking he was better off alone, that nothing and no one could tether him to this world again. But Ghost had changed that. He had shown Jake that some things were worth fighting for, even if they weren't meant to stay. Jake let out a slow breath, tipping his hat lower over his eyes. Then, as the sun set behind the mountains, he finally let himself rest. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you watched until this point, comment, I watched until here, and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the final screen. It's really exciting.